Hi, good morning. Welcome back. Uh, Today we're going to be covering Chapter 6 on the transformation of Rome, but I also want to talk to you briefly about the midterm because everybody has questions about the midterm. The midterm is going to be next Thursday. We're not going to be doing it synchronously during class time. You will have a 24-hour window in which to take the midterm. So between next Wednesday at midnight and next Thursday at midnight, you will have to take the midterm. It won't be available other times than that. You will have 2 hours to complete it. Now, the midterm is worth 150 points. So it's going to be basically several multiple choice questions. There will be a map question. There will be an artwork identification on it. And then there will be a short essay of no more than a paragraph or no less than a paragraph on a particular topic. Now, we've already outlined the topics. I did so was it last week? Anyway, when we first met, and I talked about the topics that we should be looking at during this class, was government, religion, communications, art, and technology. So I will have questions about one question for each of those topics, and you will have to pick one question and answer it. You won't have to answer all five, but you will have to read the question very carefully. Are there any more questions? As always, you can either stick a question in the live chat or email it to me, and I will be sure and take a quick look at it during the break time. And I think that's about it. I'm going to try to make this midterm as straightforward as possible. However, I do have to have a time limit on it, and I do have to have it available only for a short period of time, and I do have to have it only one chance to access it. So you won't be able to go in, take it, go out, try it again, or go in and out while you're taking it. So you need to do it all in one sitting. I'm going to have the quizzes for chapters 3 and 4 up, hopefully tomorrow. How many questions? Yes. I don't know how many questions there will be yet. I probably take that 150 points and make the short essay worth 50 points and then divide up the other 100 points between the multiple choice questions and the map questions and the art identification questions. I'm going to sneeze. All right. Practicing proper coughing technique. Anyway, so how many questions? I do not exactly know. If they're 5 points each, I can't possibly have more than 20 questions. So figure it that way. And then the 50 points for the short essay. So that's going to be an important thing to do. Itashbaqua asks, the midterm will include chapters 1 through 6. Yes, it will only include chapters 1 through 6, because that's all we have totally covered by that time. Let me check my email. There's no new emails. All right. So if we can, you're very welcome. If we can, I would like to start on this chapter. Now, I will be talking a lot about religion in this chapter. I am not talking about religion in order to change your minds or in any way affect your own convictions or beliefs. What I'm doing is talking about religion in order to place it into the historical context. It is meaningful within the historical context, and some people might know the faith traditions of these religions already, but maybe don't quite understand the historical context and how we understand the evidence that were provided for it. So hopefully you'll get a better understanding of that. So just want to, put that proviso out there that I'm not trying to alter your beliefs in any way. So I talked about Rome. We had a discussion about how the Romans were an extremely expansive, militaristic, avarice empire. They're wanting to expand to be as big as possible, increase their tax base, cover as much land as they possibly can throughout the known world. And they will be quite successful at doing that. Once the empire is established under Octavian Caesar Augustus, then the military will spread out to both protect the borders and to put down any insurrections. One of the places that's going to be the most violent in terms of insurrections will be the area of Judea, an area that we now know as Syria and Israel. This will be an area that will see quite a bit of guerrilla and terrorist fighting. Yeah, I'm using those terms. There was a lot of terrorist activity in the first century CE and before, because many of these people did not want to be subjugated by the Roman Empire. And so we're going to see in the midst of all of these insurrections the growth of a new faith tradition, and that's Christianity. And it is part of this historical process. You cannot leave it out of what is happening in Judea and what is happening in the Roman Empire at the time. It will come to shape the Roman Empire. It will take a few centuries, and it will be a very difficult transition, but eventually it will go from being a hidden religion to being the official state religion of the Roman Empire. But we have to find out the very beginnings of Christianity. Of course, it grows out of the career of a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Now, we know about him from first century sources. Most are known as the first 4 books of the New Testament, or the 4 Gospels. And these tell of a man who was born in Judea, who at around age 30 will start a career as through preaching, through healing, and through teaching. He will be a wandering teacher throughout that time, although he won't travel very widely. There will be a moment around 30 CE in which he will make an entry into the city of Jerusalem. This entry will be heralded by some of his supporters with what could only be called a messianic entry. They will greet him as the Messiah, as the chosen one who will save Israel. However, the moment he chooses to make this entry is during Passover. So according to the Gospels, according to the first 4 books of the Bible, there is a great amount of activity that happens in Jerusalem around him. And to the Roman governor, a man named Pontius Pilate, this activity is going to look seditious. It looks like one of the insurrectionist movements, one of the violent insurrectionist movements that Pontius Pilate had been putting down. And so he's going to make the decision to arrest Jesus of Nazareth and have him executed without a trial. Jesus of Nazareth is a citizen of Judea, not a citizen of Rome, so he does not come under any of the Latin rights that Roman citizens have of having a trial. He is merely grabbed as a criminal and executed quite quickly. Uh, and so that's what our earliest sources tell us about Jesus of Nazareth. Now, we have since, through archaeology and through a chance finding of documents, have gotten a primary source, which means a firsthand account of what was happening in Judea at that moment. In around 1940 or so, a shepherd will find a bunch of pottery, sealed jars in a cave, and when they are opened, they will reveal scrolls that were 2,000 years old that were hidden in these jars. Now, as scrolls go, they're rolled up, they're very difficult to unroll, and enormously brittle. They just fall apart. But these scrolls come to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. There have been attempts to open some of them, which is very dangerous. It was done without a lot of modern technology, which meant that some of the scrolls were destroyed. So many of them have not been unrolled yet. There is some promising technology in using MRIs and CT scans and X-rays in order to be able to read the scrolls as they're rolled up. If they can do that, then they're going to change a lot about our knowledge of the time. But those Dead Sea Scrolls that we have been able to read, open up and read, tell the story of Judea. As of yet, there has been no mention of Jesus of Nazareth in these Dead Sea Scrolls. There is, however, a discussion of what the politics were like in Judea. And this opens up a whole range of ideas about what had been going on. Why did the Romans treat Jesus of Nazareth so cruelly, so quickly? Mainly because of the insurrectionist movement that I mentioned before. There were people known as zealots. It was a group of people that would be trying to get rid of the Romans and the Roman occupation, constantly fighting against it with guerrilla movements, with terrorism, with acts of violence. And the Roman legions were very keen to put these acts of violence down. The violence will continue to get worse and worse until about 66 CE, when the Romans will decide that the best way to crush this insurrection is to destroy the temple in Jerusalem, the most important of the Jewish buildings in Jerusalem. This takes away the Jews' ability to make certain sacrifices, to follow certain practices that they felt were extremely important. The violence does not end, and so by 132 to 135 CE, the Romans will decide merely to destroy Jerusalem, try to destroy the city as much as possible, and make it illegal for Jews to live in the city. And this is the beginning of the Jewish diaspora, a moment at which the Jewish population goes from being in Judea to being all over Europe, North Africa, and Asia. And we will find records of Jews scattering throughout these areas and trying to establish new communities, trying to establish new lives elsewhere. So this is a movement called the Jewish diaspora. Uh, we also, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, find out a lot about the uh, political aspect of this time. The four Gospels of the New Testament don't give us a very balanced look at the politics, however, the Dead Sea Scrolls do. And we find that there were basically three main groups of political uh, political organizations in Judea at this time. The first was the Sadducees. Now, these were the hereditary temple priesthood. These were the elite of Jewish society that were the guardians of the temple, that the priestly caste comes from them, that they made the rules, that they were in direct negotiations with the Roman leadership. So they were basically the politically elite. They also were extremely conservative, and they felt they had the only and best interpretation of Jewish law. So they insisted on everyone else following their interpretation of Jewish law. Another group were the Pharisees. These were people who were not in power, but who had a different interpretation of Jewish law. And this interpretation had such aspects as an afterlife in heaven, and other interpretations that the Sadducees did not agree with. So these were basically disagreements, not necessarily based on social class or uh, uh, geographical region, but based on a belief system. The third group, and this is not really a very coordinated group at all, were called the Essenes. Now, these were a group of spiritually inclined people who would take their cue from very obscure readings of Jewish law and believed that their afterlife, their salvation, depended on asceticism. This is a lovely hard word to say. Um, Not aesthetics, which means the looks, how things look, but ascetics, which means that they lived lives of enforced poverty. They did not uh, uh, like luxuries. They did not eat rich foods. They abstained from all sorts of things like drinking or sex in some cases. Oftentimes, these Essenes would deny the flesh, as it's called, and they would live out in the wilderness or travel a lot. So it was a very uncoordinated group that had very particular ideas about how to live as a Jew and how to be saved after this particular life on earth. Now, almost all of these groups had a concept known as the Messiah. And the Messiah was a figure that had been foretold in the Old Testament or in the Jewish law, the Talmud. But this Messiah was said to be a figure that would come with a sword to save the Jews, to release them from their captivity, to kill off all of the Jewish enemies, and allow the kingdom of Judea to come back and be the most powerful kingdom. So when the followers of Jesus, when he comes into Jerusalem and they proclaim him Messiah, this is upsetting to many, many of the Jews in the city, as in they don't see him as a Messiah, and he certainly doesn't fit any of the descriptions that they had of a Messiah. But here are these people greeting him as such, or giving him a Greek title, Christos, from which we get the word Christ, which means anointed one, which means someone who is holier than everyone else. And that those that greeted him when he came into Jerusalem called him divine, a divine representative of God for all humanity. And this went against many of the ideas of the Jews in Jerusalem. And so that was part of why the Roman governor Pontius Pilate was afraid that he would have a true riot on his hands. He wanted to make sure it didn't happen, to have peace in Judea. And so that's why he would use that excuse to execute Jesus of Nazareth. So the areas that were going to be ruled by the Romans basically have got very different areas. Now, there was a Jewish king who was not the Roman governor, a fellow by the name of Herod, and he will have the rule over this area, but of course he will be ruled by the Romans in turn, but he will have a responsibility for this area. Now, the Gospels are a little bit problematic at this point because of the time of when King Herod ruled, that they specifically discuss in the Gospels, and Pontius Pilate, who they specifically discuss. These are both real people, but they lived at slightly different times. That there has to be a particular overlap so that the stories in the New Testament actually line up with the historical account. So that's why the confusion over the year 0. In the Western Europe tradition, the year 0 was supposed to be either the year of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth or the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. But to make this work with the historical context, the year 0 does not line up so handily. So that's why our years are a little bit strange there. They can't be completely and accurately accounted for. So at the death of Jesus of Nazareth, he will only have a handful of followers, and they will insist in later writings that Jesus had been resurrected, that he had been taken up to heaven. And so this story is what ignites people into following Jesus. But the earliest of the followers of Jesus insisted that he was still a Jew and they were still Jews. That in order to be a Christian to them, or a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, you had to be a Jew, which meant you had to follow Jewish covenants, covenants about clothing, covenants about food, and how food is prepared and what you can and can't eat, and covenants such as circumcision. For Jews that had been following those covenants all along, that was not an issue. But it also meant that those people who were not Jewish were being left out of this of following Jesus of Nazareth. That's going to change with a single individual, a man named Paul of Tarsus. He was born in Cilicia, and he will be a Roman citizen and an educated Greek. So he will read and write and speak Greek, but he will be a Roman citizen, but born in what we now know as part of Turkey. Anyway, he will have a conversion experience that he writes about, and reports that he will have direct revelation from Jesus. Although he will never meet the living Jesus, he claims he has a divine revelation. And that revelation is that Christianity should be open to everybody, not just Jews. That you could be Jewish, you could be Roman, you could be Gentile, which was the Jewish term for the people who lived there who were not Jewish, lived in Judea who was not Jewish. And so there would become this argument within very early Christianity about who could be a Christian. Now, Paul of Tarsus is going to win out because he is going to make stronger arguments. He is going to write and travel extensively, and his writing and traveling will convince more and more people to open up Christianity to Jews and non-Jews, which of course opens up the possibilities for more people to join into this group. The writings of Paul are letters to various groups of Christians. They were small groups that met in pretty much secret. There were no churches built at this time. But his letters make up the bulk of the New Testament after the four Gospels, the four first books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then you get books titled letters to the, or epistles to the Hebrews, letters to the Corinthians, letters to the Romans. These are all Paul's letters. And it is through Paul, through his Greek education, through his writing and advocacy and travels and talking to all these people, that he really creates this sense of what Christianity should be. You see, because Jesus did not necessarily leave instructions on how to create an organization. He left instructions for living an ethical life, but they weren't set down to be an organized group. It's Paul who organizes the group, the earliest of the group. It's Paul who comes up with the concept of ecclesia or church, which is different than the temples and the state religions of the Romans or the temples of the Jews. This is something completely different, a very different sort of organization. So Paul's work is going to take him throughout most of the Eastern Mediterranean area, Asia Minor, Greece, Macedonia, and his final journey, according to the tradition, he is on the way to Spain to talk to the congregants there. And as he goes through Rome, he is arrested and according to tradition, executed there. But he's first given a trial because he is a Roman citizen after all. So this travels that he makes him possibly one of the most influential figures of the very early Christians. And we're talking about Christianity in the first century. So those earliest converts to the Christian faith will be Hellenized Jews, Jews that could speak Greek, that were part of this pan-Hellenistic world. But they will also start, with the work of Paul, also start including other people, non-Jews. Now, these are all people who did not meet Jesus, who are learning about him through scraps of written history, a lot of oral tradition. And so people outside of this movement and people inside of this movement are trying to figure out to pigeonhole him, if I can use that word, where he fits in all of these different worldviews that were around him at the time. Um, People wondered if he was a Stoic because there are elements of Stoicism that we find in the preaching of Jesus of Nazareth. Was he Zoroastrian? Remember, the Zoroastrian religion was a monotheistic religion created by a single man, Zoroaster, also known as Zarathustra, who created this ethos, much of which is repeated in the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. There were also mystery religions that had been included into the Roman state religions. Mystery religions like Isis, which was an Egyptian religion, or Mithras, which was still is a mystery religion that has a single hero, and that single hero, the celebration of his birth is December 25th. So people are wondering, because there is not a set creation or even set literature to understand this new uh, faith tradition, what it is. So all of these different groups had similarities to Christianity. They had elaborate initiation ceremonies. They were held in secret. The outside observer couldn't help but wondering, are they part of these other groups? Were they Essenes? Were they Pharisees? Because some of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth match up to those ideas as well. But the differences will come in that the Christians will form communities. It will not be necessarily an individual ethos like Zoroastrian or Stoicism. And they allowed women to participate. And in fact, women will become the main benefactors. Uh, this new religion, this new faith tradition, does not have churches. They certainly can't set up temples. So women, especially fairly wealthy women, women who had substance in order to do this, would invite them into their homes and thereby become the patrons of this new religious movement. So it was extraordinarily unusual for its time, in that these were secret rituals held in the homes of rich women, and that this new faith tradition appealed to a broad class of individuals. If you recall, Stoicism only appealed or mainly appealed to military people, or you had Mithras, the original religion of Mithras, which only appealed to a certain type of soldiers. So this appealed to everybody: men, women, rich, poor, and slaves. And this made it very different than a lot of the other movements around. Now, how did the early Christians relate to the Roman state? After all, Rome had control over all of this area. Well, first we have to look at the arrangements that the Jews had made with the Romans. Now, I know I talked about insurrectionists, movements, and terrorism and guerrilla warfare. That happened in different groups of Jews that were not in power. Those Jews who were in power, mainly the Sadducees, the interpreters of Jewish law, they had made negotiated agreements with the Roman leadership. Because you see, the Roman state religions were inclusive. They wanted to include everybody, that new religions would come in and they would include them. However, the monotheism of the Hebrews was exclusive. They could not bring in any other gods. They could only worship one God. And so that goes directly against the Roman ideals for religion. how to figure this out? Well, the Jews came up, the Jews and the Romans negotiated a settlement, and that was the Jews paid extra taxes so that they did not have to worship the Roman pantheon, which in later years of the Roman Empire also included the emperor. The emperor had to be worshipped as a god at times. So this was not something that the Jews had any interest in. And so the negotiated settlement with the leadership of the Jews was that they paid heavy extra taxes and they were awarded special protections by the Romans. That was another reason why the Jewish establishment didn't want to see these rabble rousers like Jesus of Nazareth or the Zealots, that they had negotiated something special and they didn't want it ruined. So Christianity, having no elite, having no structure, hierarchical structure, but meeting organically in small groups, they didn't have this negotiated settlement. And yet they wanted to be fiercely monotheistic as well. And so they are going to arouse suspicion with the Romans. And we have letters from the Roman generals saying, what do we do about these people? They won't worship the Roman gods. They meet in secret. And we'll see detractors say awful things about the Christians, that they have certain ceremonies. They were suspicious of them because women were encouraged to join in and slaves were encouraged to join in, that they had the basic single ritual of the Christian church at this time was called an agape feast, or a love feast. And I'm going to talk about this in a second. These people also worshipped a person to whom the Romans assumed was a criminal, was a condemned criminal, someone who had been executed for being a criminal. And the Romans were also worried about sedition at these secret meetings, that they were possibly plotting against the Roman government or the emperor, because they had been putting up with these Jewish zealots and all of their fighting against the Roman Empire. So the Romans looked at the early Christians with a great deal of suspicion. But for the most part, for the first 2 centuries of the existence of Christianity, they're going to be mainly ignored. And this will allow the religion to slowly spread by word of mouth. Now, as I said, the most important ritual for all of these groups was called the agape love feast. Now, agape is a Greek word for love, but a specific Greek word for love. The Greeks have many words for loves, but you see, this is an early fresco, and it shows a woman who is with a group of other people, men. Perhaps some of these people are slaves, and they are enjoying a feast together. This would not have happened in respectable Roman homes. Rarely did men and women dine together. Certainly the slaves were not sitting at the table with the owners, the owners of the slaves. So it was for the early Christians, it was a unifying moment. For the Romans, it's seditious. It is upsetting the social order. Now, I said the Greeks, and remember the erudite, the educated and higher class Romans spoke Greek. If you are going to try to denigrate a group, using the wrong word for love was possibly a way to do this. I don't know if you remember way back in the Super Bowl that there was an ad for the Greeks have 4 words for love, and then they go to define it. I yelled at the television. No, they had many more words for love, a lot more words for love. I've only got 7 on the screen. Excuse me. And this is still not a complete list. The Greeks had the word eros, which means sexual passion. Philia, which is a deep friendship. Friends, the city of brotherly love or friendly city, Philadelphia. Um, Ludus, which is playful love or puppy love. Some of you are probably do not realize that the peacock masked singer Donny Osmond, when he was only like 12, he had the #1 hit song called Puppy Love. I won't sing it this morning, my throat hurts. But yeah, ludus, that puppy love of young kids pretending to have a romantic relationship. Then there's agape, which means selfless love or empathy or love for all or unconditional love. So it's quite fitting for these kind of feasts for them to call them agape feasts. There is pragma, which is long-lasting love, the kind of love you would have between old married couples, uh, kind of where we get the pragmatic idea. There's philautia, which is the love of the self. Now, this one for the Greeks had two different ideas, one good, one bad. The love of self or philautia that was bad was, of course, narcissism. Being so in love with yourself, you cannot uh, uh, have any empathy for anyone else. But the good aspect of philautia is to having what's the term I'm looking for? Having enough love of oneself that one can love other people. If someone absolutely hates themselves, it's very difficult for them to actually love someone else. So philautia actually has two aspects of the same love of the self. And storge, that's love between parents and children. So that's just 7 different uses of the word love. For a word that we in English, we use one word, love, to mean all these different things. But the Greeks had different terms. And you can imagine if you are communicating with someone else and you wanted to say, not nice things about this agape feast. You wouldn't call it an agape feast, you would call it eros, sexual passion, which would imply that you had men and women and slaves all together having an orgy rather than the ritual that they were actually performing. So it would be, yes, unconditional love. That's You've got it right, Liege. That's exactly what we're talking about. Um, so yeah, if you wanted to denigrate this new group, you'd use the wrong word. So the Roman Empire, after the Pax Romana, is going to go through a difficult time. They're going to have some less than good rulers, less than good emperors, and that's going to create a downhill slide so that by 235 CE, we're going to see the authority bouncing back and forth between a bunch of generals. So for about 50 years, we're going to see 49 years, we're going to see 26 different barracks emperors. They're called barracks emperors because they are generals whose legions help them become emperor. 26 and 49 years. That makes your head spin. How you can't establish authority. You can't do what needs to be done in an empire if you're changing the guy every couple months or couple of years. It's going to get to the point. This is how bad it gets. Uh, there's one way to take the emperorship, and that's by force. That's making enough problems. That's killing people. That's a very, or an assassination. That's a very violent way to do it. At one point, the Praetorian Guard, the bodyguards of the emperor himself, decide that they don't like this emperor and they know another man who wants to become emperor. And so the Praetorian Guards get the existing emperor and the man who wants to be an emperor into a bidding war. They are selling the office. And so they go to the emperor, how much will you pay to stay in power? And then they go to the man who wants to be emperor, how much does he want to, how much will he pay to get into power? And it goes back and forth, the number going higher and higher and higher until eventually the man who wants to get power gives out a number, and the man who is emperor stops bidding. And so the Praetorian Guards get rid of the man who was emperor and bring in the new guy to be emperor. Now, the new guy, the guy who was going to be emperor and eventually wins the bid, was counting on the treasury of Rome to pay the Praetorian Guards. Well, the emperor, who had lost his position, stopped bidding because he knew how much money was in the treasury, and it was not enough to pay the Praetorian Guards. So the new emperor gets kicked out right away, right after the old emperor. So that's the kind of craziness that this 3rd century crisis ensues. And it's a giant area that needs a firm hand and a good administration running it. But if you've got these crazy guys coming in and out and the administration is breaking down, there's got to be new changes, and it doesn't happen. You've got too many emperors who are just worried about staying in power or staying alive for the next few hours. So these guys are not up to the task. And so we're going to see a period of real poverty and famine and disease. This is going to be starting to tear apart the Roman Empire, that it becomes quite clear this is an unruly sort of situation, and it's got to be handled with a firm hand, or something new has to happen. Well, that something new is going to be under the new emperor Diocletian. Diocletian comes in 284, and he lasts for over 20 years. And that's the moment of stability that's needed in the empire to kind of get it back on its tracks and get it moving again. But his answer is to divide the empire in half. And he will take one half and rule one half, and he will give the other half to his friend Maximian to rule. So now, instead of one emperor trying to rule a huge space, it's 2 separate emperors trying to rule a bit smaller space. Diocletian is going to move his capital into Greece. There's a bigger population there. There's a bigger tax base, and it doesn't have the infrastructure problems that Maximian is going to find keeping his capital in Rome. Now, this works so well that Diocletian is going to end up dividing the 2 parts of the empire again. So by the time of end of Diocletian's rule, we are going to see the empire in 4 separate pieces. We have the district of Constantius, which is the green. The pink is the district of Maximian. We have the district of Galerius, which is the orange, and the district of Diocletian. So they all have these boundaries and these divisions. And so there's like, they don't call the new guys emperors, they call them Caesars. So you've got two emperors and two Caesars that are running these areas. So that's by the end of Diocletian's rule, we see the empire broken into four separate parts. But that's basically not one of the policies that Diocletian is best known for. Diocletian, not just dividing up the empire, is going to try to find a scapegoat, someone to blame, someone to say things went wrong in the empire because there is a presence there of certain people who do not follow the laws. And Diocletian is going to find a particular minority in which to blame. And that minority is going to be the monotheists in the Roman Empire. Now, at the beginning of the 4th century, at 300 CE, the Christians are about 5% of the population. In the United States as an aggregate, African Americans are 10 to 15% of the population, so figure about half of that. Of course, we don't have really strong demographics. They didn't have the kind of census that we have, but so you get the feeling about half of the population of African Americans in America. So 5%. But that still is a sizable number. And Diocletian is going to blame the monotheists. There's two different groups, Christians and another group from Persia called the Manichaeans. And he's going to say to the rest of the empire, Diocletian will form a decree that any group that is not properly worshiping the Roman gods is subversive and they need to have their citizenship removed. So imagine that. Somebody who has a specific religion no longer being a Roman citizen. That's bad enough. But that meant they could not hold military rank. They could not be in the army. They could not be a government official if they had their citizenship removed. And this is the thinking on Diocletian's part, is that he's going to look at the traditional conservative pious nature of the Romans and their polytheistic religion. Remember, it's transactional. And he is going to say, look, they're not making the proper sacrifices. The gods are angry at us. They either need to start making these sacrifices or we need to get rid of them so that the gods will be happy with us and things will go well in the Roman Empire. So the monotheists become this outgroup. They become, as a minority, they become the scapegoat. They become blamed for everything. And this is the start of the great persecution of Christians, as it's called. This is the start when Christians truly have to go underground and hide so that they're not arrested and executed. They've had their citizenship revoked. They no longer have a right to trial. They can be executed out of hand. And this execution is going to take the form of course, crucifixions. It's going to become part of the Colosseum spectacle. Executions are going to be done in public, as viciously as possible, in order to create a spectacle and in order to be a warning to everyone else. This is a moment at which the Christians are fed to the lions, the Christians they manage to catch. So if you are going for a day in the Colosseum, you might have uh, acrobats and some gladiatorial combat in the morning. Around lunchtime, the wealthier citizens would go home and have supper, or they go to a friend's house and have lunch. The less poor, or the less rich people would stay in the Colosseum, and that is the moment that they would have the executions. Um, and they would be part of the spectacle. And then later, when it cools off a little bit, you have the wealthy people come back, and then that's when you have the real big gladiatorial contests. So the Romans make it illegal to be a Christian. They make it the Christians the scapegoat for all the problems in the empire, and they turn their executions into spectacles. This is going to form the Christian identity a little bit later, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So that's going to break down with the death of Diocletian. We're going to see fighting for who's going to become the leaders of these empires. And eventually, these four parts of the empire, or tetrarchy as they're called, is going to break down into infighting. And one side is going to be fighting another. In the area of what we now know as Great Britain and France, the son of the Caesar who is in charge of that area, his name is Constantine, will be wanting to take over the entire empire. He has plans to take it over. However, he doesn't want to have to fight between the other three parts. He's kind of very smart man, and so he is going to let them fight each other. He's going to stay out of it. There will be a major battle for who has control of Rome. So there's going to be two parts of this tetrarchy who are going to be fighting each other over the control of Rome. And Constantine is going to stay out and bide his time, wait for them, whoever wins. And he knows whoever wins is going to be weakened by all this warfare. And the moment they win Rome, that's when he plans to strike. Now, Constantine was not a Christian. He was a devotee to one of the cults of the polytheists called Sol Invictus, or the Invincible Sun. Kind of an irony of terms there. But he is going to wait until the fighting dies down. One man, Maximius, is going to claim the throne, and that is when Constantine will take his legions and march on Rome. Now, he will be right at the outskirts of the city of Rome, ready to cross a bridge to do battle, the Meletian Bridge. And his army will be camped on the other side of the bridge. The Romans will be watching from the walls as they're camped. And according to Constantine and his biographer, Constantine will have a vision. He will see something in the sky. And what he describes as seeing in the sky are two Greek letters, the letters chi and rho. To us, they look like the X and P, but those are Greek letters, chi. The X is chi, and the P is rho. Those are the first two letters in the word Christ. And this is one of the old Christian symbols that they used to use to let each other know they were Christian, or they would chalk it on the wall of a meeting place so that people knew there were Christians inside. The Christian symbolism is an interesting bit of study. The symbol of the fish, the symbol of the chalice. These were all secret symbols that Christians used to identify each other. And here is Constantine has this image in a vision, and he claims to hear a voice that said, "In this sign you will conquer." So Constantine has this symbol, the Chi and Rho, painted on the shields of all of his soldiers. And so the next morning, he and his soldiers are lined up to do battle. And all of his soldiers now have this big symbol. Now, you've got to think inside the city of Rome, the spectators that are lining the walls and standing on the roofs to see what is happening, they're looking down and they're seeing these symbols all over. One of their symbols, if they are a Christian. And you've got to think this is going to affect them. This is going to take that part of the population, especially that part that has been in hiding, and say, hey, we have a champion. And it's this guy, not the guy in Rome. And so they're going to go over to the other side. And the emperor, the current emperor who comes out to do battle with Constantine, loses. And Constantine is victorious in battle. And he takes Rome and he stops the persecution of Christians. He will, in fact, have signed what's called the Edict of Milan. And that edict will allow for complete religious freedom of worship throughout the entire empire. Everyone is free to worship as they want. Now, he is not going to force conversion to Christianity, but he will make it a favored religion. And of course, many emperors had special religious followings, like Constantine, before this moment, favored Sol Invictus, and there will be other emperors that will favor other gods. But now it's the Christians who will become a favored nation. So, what happens at this moment is a change in how the Christians are going to react. They are going to change from being a hidden religion to being a very vocal, organized religion. But that all has to grow up. Remember, they've been in hiding. You can't just come out of hiding and have this all made. The Christians, because they were hiding, because they could not address each other in the open, there was a lot of controversies as to the nature of Christianity. This is before the New Testament has been put together. Not every Christian is seeing all the same literature. And in fact, they're sometimes seeing literature that they don't agree on. They're going to get into big disputes over doctrine or rules or dogma, what's called practices. And they're going to be very disruptive. There will be groups. One will be the Arians, led by a bishop from, I think, Spain, known as Arius, who will insist that the Trinity, or the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as it is established in other parts of the Christian church, the Arians will say, no, that doesn't exist. That's not monotheistic. And so, under Constantine, the work of the emperor and the work of the religious leaders are going to come together to try to establish a church or establish what is orthodox. Orthodox is a Greek term which means straight thought or good teaching. And this is what is going to establish from these disparate parts. They're going to try to establish what is correct or good thoughts. Orthodoxy becomes the order of the day. And Constantine will allow this or help it by gathering all the bishops together in a conference called the Council of Nicaea, which will meet in 325. The emperor will be there. Here is a depiction of the Council of Nicaea, and they will start to agree on what is doctrine, Christian doctrine, what is Christian theology, what should everyone believe, trying to make those belief systems universal. And they are very much born out of a Roman understanding of leadership and organization. And in fact, what you will see is the new church, this new church becoming formed very much like the old Roman Empire. So if you have an emperor, you have the Senate. Yes, the Senate is still meeting. You have the military enforcing the rules, and you have the plebeians. Everybody else. Well, what the Council of Nicaea and the emperor and the new religious leadership are going to do is create a hierarchy in the church, so that on top you have the Pontifex Maximus. Instead of the Senate, you have the bishops, who will be representatives of certain regions. Instead of the military, you have the priests. And instead of the plebeians, you have the lay people. So they truly organize this new church structure just like they organize the government. They also will decide what is basically the canon of the church. They're going to start to decide what are the books that should be included in the scripture for the church. This is kind of like Star Wars and establishing the canon stories versus the decanonical works. The term canon is the word for an organization of literature that is officially accepted. That is orthodox. So these are terms we use a lot. So the establishment of straight thought or orthodoxy means that they've got to get rid of all the other people. Now, the opposite of orthodox, what isn't straight thinking, is officially labeled heresy, which is basically for the church considered a disease, something that has to be rooted out. And of course, the Arians, and not believing in the Trinity becomes established as the doctrine of the church, and the Arians have to either agree or they're condemned. And some are even executed, or they have to exile themselves. So this Council of Nicaea is extremely important. There will be multiple councils of Nicaea after this. Some Christians now, during the course of the liturgical year, might recite the Nicene Creed. This is the ideas of orthodoxy that come from the Council of Nicaea. That's why they call it the Nicene Creed. And if you know the liturgy, you understand that this is what we believe, boom, 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 and goes through and lists it all. But what does revoked mean? It means that you take something away. That if someone was a citizen and then they are no longer citizens, that's revoking their citizenship. If you are a driver and have a driver's license and you commit too many traffic violations, or you're caught drunken driving, the court can revoke your driver's license, take it away. And so this is what they would do to revoke someone's citizenship or revoke their positions. Anyway, so this change, this very big change, is going to make changes in the church. I'm going to take a break now, if we can, for about 15 minutes because I've been yammering on for quite some time. Let's take a break until 12:25, and I'll come back and we'll discuss some of the different views that are going to be affecting this new church. Okay, we're back. Uh, so, what is the organization of Christianity into the ecclesia or the new church? What does this new ecclesiastical organization mean for the people who attend, the lay people? Uh, the term that's used is lay people or laity. It means it changes the flavor of the church substantially, in that women had been extremely important in the early church. Jesus of Nazareth had many women followers who are recorded in the New Testament, in the four Gospels. There were women leaders in the early church. There were women who had been persecuted by Diocletian in the early church. This is going to change. This new institutional church, the establishment church, is going to reflect the patriarchy of Rome, as I showed. It's going to reflect the organization that the Roman Empire had. The Christianity is now going to become extremely masculine. It's going to have inroads into the military, inroads into the government. The emperor and the Pontifex Maximus will be seen as working together and very closely. And the emphasis will be on asceticism. The ideas of old Rome and old Roman society, especially the rich portions of Roman society, the dinner parties, the excessive drinking, the loose sexuality, that's going to be lessened during this part. We're going to see a very conservative movement take a hold, in which sexuality is going to be really very downplayed. Uh, and it creates a real change of view. Remember, you had Roman pantheists running around, polytheists, but you also had that pan Hellenic movement, the Greeks, who were still there, and they're going to change their attitudes on physical purity, that sort of thing. We are going to see those celebrations of violence, like the gladiatorial games. Those are going to be lessened and lessened, to the point that the spectacle of the Colosseum, with the gladiatorial games, the executions, the animal hunts, all of these grand spectacles are going to be going away, and they're going to be seen as part of the old polytheistic attitudes. We're going to see basically institutions like the theater that were associated with these spectacles. They're going to be subsumed, they're going to be lessened, so we won't see that much. In an idea of fostering asceticism. The idea that bodies are no longer in service to the state, or that they're in service to God. So their highest association is to God, no longer to the state, no longer to the emperor. And that means, in some circles, a renunciation of sexuality, denial of physical pleasures. The Christians make it through that time of the great persecutions of Diocletian. Those people who died during this time will be considered martyrs, or people who had died for the faith. They are considered saints or holy people. But there's no chance, now that Constantine is in charge, and as long as people are following the Orthodox ideals, that there isn't the chance of being executed just for your beliefs, as long as they are the Orthodox beliefs. So this new church has got to find ways of increasing this idea of holiness, and that's going to be through denial of physical pleasure. You're going to see hermits setting themselves up as holy men. But virginity is going to be a very high spiritual standard, not sexual. And the denigration of sexuality and the encouragement of the patriarchy is going to have a real negative impact on women. They're going to lose their status within this new church. The Christians tended to be very urbanized, and those people who are not urbanized, those people who live in the rural areas, tended to stay polytheistic, tended to keep the old attitudes. And so the term for someone who is out in the country, paganus, becomes a derogatory term for those people who are still following polytheistic rituals. So the Christianity is going to be the the religion of ambitious people, of urban people, people who wanted to move up the ladder in the administration are all going to be turning Christian. Now, Constantine was fairly tolerant of Christians and non-Christians, although he favored Christians after he came to power. But after him, there's going to be more and more emphasis on conversion to Christianity, except for one emperor, Julian the Apostate, who will rule for about 3 years and attempt to abandon Christianity and go back to the polytheistic ways. He will start a war over it. He and his followers will eventually be killed in battle, and they will no longer be following the edicts that Julian had put down to insist that everyone has to go back to the polytheistic religion. Those are just going to be allowed to lapse. And in fact, shortly after Julian the Apostate is killed, a new Emperor Theodosius, who will rule around 379, is going to prohibit pagan worship altogether in the Roman Empire. And so within 3 centuries, we go from a Christian church that had been persecuted, that had been hiding, that dare not be out in public, to actually physically persecuting those people who were not Christian. So 3 centuries doesn't seem like a fast climb to us, but we're talking about changing the mentality of millions of people over just a couple of generations. So Constantine, in building the church as far as an intellectual and faith institution, is going to be making quite a few structural changes, but he's also going to be making physical structural changes to the empire. He is going to move the focus of the empire from Rome to a city called, after himself, Constantinople. Now, there had been a city there. It was called Byzantium. Uh, so Constantine is going to move his city. It is a perfect place to have a city. It is right between Asia Minor and the European continent, an area known as Thrace. It is the shortest amount of distance between Turkey and Europe, called the Bosphorus Strait. It's the way that you have to go to get from the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea. So from that point, you could rule all of the movement of goods. In fact, there will be a moment in time where the citizens of Constantinople will build a giant chain across this area to keep boats from going in and out. It's very easily defended because it's surrounded on three sides by water. So there's just a small land area coming in. So it's a brilliant place to put a city, and it will be a prominent, important city until, well, it will continue to be a prominent and important city. It's still there, but it will be basically the focus of the Roman world until the year 1453, when it will be taken over by the Ottoman Turks. So it's going to last over 1100 years at its spot. Now, the city is still there. We call it Istanbul, and it is the biggest city in Turkey. So it really is a prominent sort of place. But this means, with the capital moving east, with the emperor moving east, all the power shifts from west to east. People are all of a sudden seeing that Rome is not such a nice place anymore. Also, Constantine is going to break with the tradition of emperors not being the children of emperors. He's going to break with that and set up a purely dynastic monastery. He's going to be passing down the empire to his children. Unfortunately, it is the law that he has to divide it up between his children, and that's going to start a true civil war. But that's kind of minor in comparison to what's going to be happening, the difference between the Latin West and the Greek East. Constantinople, the people of Constantinople spoke Greek. The people in that eastern part of the Roman Empire spoke Greek. They will consider themselves the Roman Empire. The people in the West will continue to use Latin because the erudite people, the educated people, the people in administrative power are going to choose to go east. And so a lot of the West is going to lose those people who spoke Greek. And the people who are on the lower economic scale are going to be left, and they're going to be speaking Latin. And that's why we call it the Latin West and the Greek East. The East is much more wealthy. It's a center of activity. Trade there is big. The West slowly becomes more poor. The infrastructure falls apart because so much of the Roman Empire depended on slaves, and slaves are expensive. If you're a poorer landowner, you can't afford slaves to work it. So you're having to work it yourself. So the West becomes much more poor, much more on the periphery. Rome becomes very unimportant. Rome loses a lot of its brilliant infrastructure, and even to a point that those people who lead that western part of the empire move out of Rome entirely to an Italian city called Ravenna. And that becomes the capital of the western part of the Roman Empire. So there's this gap between East and West. Because there is fewer military people in the West, a lot of the military is pulled to the east to defend Constantinople. There's less military in the West. Then we see those movements of people who did not want to be under the control of the Roman Empire. They're going to start fighting against the Roman Empire, this much weakened Western part of the Roman Empire. And so we're going to definitely see movements in Britain, in Gaul, in Hispania, Germania, Egypt, North Africa. There's a large section of what we now know as Northern Europe and Western Europe. Those are all going to start fighting against the Romans who are still there. They're going to start exerting the cultures not of Rome, but of the people who were originally in those spots, Gauls, and the various communities and tribes there. Italians, the people of the Italian peninsula, are going to be treated as a provincial state by Constantinople, by the um, uh, by the by the new Roman Empire in Constantinople. There will be fewer troops sent. If there's violence, it's going to be ignored. Constantinople is still going to ask for taxes, but it's going to be taxation with very little protection and very little representation in that government. They become the periphery. Um, this is hard on the people, the Romans who are left, because they're going to see their area very much under threat from the Britons, from the Gauls, from this whole new group of people who are moving in to take up power and land in that power vacuum. Now, the Roman Empire will have seen these people as people to be occupied, people to be ruled over, and of course, as barbarians. Bar. They did not speak Greek. They spoke some barbarian language that sounded to the Greeks like bar. That's where we get the term barbarian. They were not these naked, painted blue, running around with axes type of people. They were settled agriculturalists. They had been people who had traded with the Roman Empire for generations. Many of them had become Christians as well. They saw the Roman Empire as a group that they traded with. But now that the Roman Empire seems to be slowly receding from them, they are seeing more and more benefits of taking on more and more land. But it means that those Romans in the West are unable to defend themselves. The armies, the legions that the Romans had put in those areas, they stopped recruiting people from the city of Rome. They were recruiting local people. And these local people had wives and children and family in the area that they were now serving. And this went totally contrary to how the legions under the earlier emperors moved. They could be moved around like chess pieces. They could, a area was in danger, they could send legions to that, and it was no problem. Well, all of a sudden, these legions are staying in one place, establishing homes, establishing land. They are tied to this place. Uh, if any one of you have been in the military, have military families, you will know that the military moves everybody around quite frequently. Military brats, as they like to call themselves, like to talk about how they moved from place to place every couple of years. And they got used to moving, and they felt like they did not have, this one town that they grew up for generations and called home. Well, that's how you make a military that is flexible and movable, and you can go all over the world with them, like our modern military system in the United States is. But when people are tied to their lands, they don't want to go fight somewhere else. They want to fight for their land. The East had money to keep that military going and to defend themselves. So these cities in the East had money to have military, had infrastructure. They are areas where trade and industry are important. They have the money to even import food. So they're doing just fine in these big urban areas. It is the West that we see the urban areas are starting to dry up with less trade, smaller populations, and a brain drain. If anyone is good at business or is an artist or a craftsman, and the people you are around in the western part of the empire don't have the money to hire you or don't have the money to buy your goods, forget it. I'm moving to Constantinople. So there's a brain drain going on of people who are leaving the West, leaving essentially the people who are there are agriculturalists, and are not interested in trade. So it's going to affect who is there. And then you're going to get other groups migrating into Western Europe. Now, I love to call this the spaghetti map, because you see all these lines of movements of different groups. Now, these are different, we call them tribes. They were not primitive tribes. They were groups of families that considered themselves a community, but they would start moving into these places. And the map shows you where they come from, essentially, and how they move around. And you can see the dates of how they move around. And you've got people like the Goths, the Huns, the Lombards, the Franks, and the Vandals. The Vandals are not is not a verb to vandalize. Original Vandals were actually a tribe called the Vandals, and they will be moving in. They will be plenty destructive as they go. So the term to vandalize is named after these people because they were particularly violent. One of the main groups that is moving in are the Goths. And the Goths will have settled down and have a long-term relationship with the Romans on the border area. They will grow food, they will trade with the Romans, and they will think that they have a pretty good relationship. But they will settle in this Eastern European area, north of the Black Sea, an area we call Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, that intersection. But they will be forced out of that area in 340 by a particularly violent group called the Huns. Now, the Goths will have to move, so their first impulse is to move into and seek refuge with the Romans that are still in the Roman Empire, still part of that structure. The first wave of Goths who move in with the Romans are going to see this opportunity to make money. They will capture them and sell them as slaves to the eastern part of the empire. Well, it doesn't take long before the Goths realize if we go to the Romans, we're going to be turned into slaves, and if we stay where the Huns are, we're all going to get killed. So their answer to this is to arm themselves into a military unit. And they are the Goths that will be known as the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. The Visigoths will move to the west. The Ostrogoths will move eventually to the east. But the Goths, as you can see on this map, will head down towards Constantinople and the eastern part of the Roman Empire, fighting as they go. The current emperor, when they get there, being a fairly bright fellow, is going to do the smart thing and pay them off and say, here's lots of money, go west. And so the Visigoths are going to be moving through the areas of Greece and eventually take the Italian peninsula. It is the Visigoths who become the leaders in this Western European or Western Roman Empire. And by the 4th century, we will be seeing a Visigoth on the throne of the Western Roman Empire as the Roman emperor. So this that map gets really crazy to see how these different groups move around, but it's very much migrations of people moving into areas that the Western Roman Empire had been, but they lose their grasp on this area. So, going back to Constantinople, creating this new Christian identity out of the old Roman identity, removing the polytheistic ideas, but keeping the good stuff. Because the Romans had inherited much of the Greek uh, thinking and education, they're going to be trying to keep a lot of the good stuff, but get rid of the bad stuff. They wanted to replace the pagan ideals with Christian ideals. Remember, Christianity is a monotheistic movement and consequently is exclusionary. They want to exclude all of the old gods, as opposed to the polytheists who were inclusionary. They wanted to include other gods. The Christians become exclusionary. They want to get rid of all of these old ideas. And so the Christian intellectuals in Constantinople and in the Eastern Roman Empire will reinterpret these old classics for a Christian audience. They're going to weed out some of the works that had been kept for centuries. The Eastern Roman Empire will keep some of the good things. They will continue to make copies because these writings will be on very fallible, very easy to rot materials like papyrus. There will some of them will be on a little bit better materials called vellum, which will last not forever, especially certainly in the poor conditions that they were stored in the Eastern Roman Empire. But the only way to keep a thing alive, a book, a writing alive, is to copy it and to keep copying it. And all the copying had to be done by hand, by literate individuals. It was extremely expensive to do this. Uh, Papyrus was available, but it wasn't the best to do this writing on. Vellum was more and more available, but vellum is very expensive. It's not paper, it is calf skin or goat skin or sheep skin that has been prepared. The fur is all scraped off. The fat and the muscle is all scraped off, and it has to be stretched, it has to be soaked in lye, and it's got to be processed. So it's extraordinarily expensive to make, and each piece is quite expensive. So writing was kept at a minimum. Only the important stuff was kept. So those things that the Christians, the new Christian intellectuals didn't agree with, they just left out. Who would be the wiser? And so there's a lot of lost intellectual work in these areas because it was merely left to rot. Conditions were better in Alexandria, in Egypt, because it was drier, so some of that information stays there until a little bit later. A early Christian by the name of Boethus is going to be compiling these classical texts, but only keeping the stuff that he thinks is good for the Christian audience. So he's going to be leaving out a lot of stuff. He's going to concentrate on philosophy, but also change things around. Who's going to be able to tell? They don't have the originals. So he's going to rewrite, edit, and create a body of work that is interpreted in a Christian process in which happiness is not the perfect physical being or being the wisest and smartest individual or the best at logic. It's happiness is the highest good is following God and doing what Jesus said, following in his footsteps. So classical learning is going to be edited heavily during this time. But one of the great things, oh, I forgot. Let me grab something. The great technology that will be coming out of this time will be the technology of the codex. And the codex is merely a fancy word, for early books. Until this moment, when you wrote something down, it was either on a separate sheet of vellum or it was separate sheets of vellum were sewn together to make a scroll. So imagine a roll of paper towels, and you're having to read a roll of paper towels, and you start at the first paper towel and you unroll it, you roll it on one, unroll it on one side, roll it back up on the other. It is difficult to say, I know that something was in there that I had written and I read and I want to find it again. Imagine trying to find it in a scroll. You can't. You have to start at the beginning of a scroll and keep working until you find what you want. You can't put like bookmarks in. But the codex, rather than sew them the pages end to end to end, they sewed them on one end, put a cover over it to protect it, and then they can move from page to page to page. And this movement from page to page to page allows this information to be accessed randomly. And in fact, you might get someone who says, hey, let's sew some ribbons in there so that we have bookmarks and that we can put our bookmarks in one place and come back to it at a certain time. The access to these parts becomes highly randomized. You can go anywhere in the book. You can be looking at the book, or you can be trying to find something specific, and you find it, but you know that there's something back in the back that you want to refer it to. Because, fiction books, yes, we start at the beginning, we work back. But if you're trying to learn something, trying to teach something, trying to do research, then that entails going back and forth in these books. So you're apt to find something and say, I want to go back in the book. With a scroll, that would be very difficult. With a book, you take your finger, and I don't know if you know what we call this finger, the pointer finger. We also call it the index finger. And we can put it in one page, close it, and go to another part of the book. And, oh, okay, I found that, and I'm going to go back. And you can go back and forth in the book using your index finger. Now, eventually, those items that we think about being in a book, a table of contents, a title page, the index of keywords that go in the back, numbering on pages, these are all going to come later. As they use books, they come up with innovations. Hey, what if we put numbers on the page and then we list what is on each page in the front, the table of contents, so we can find out where everything is and we can go directly to that page, making the book even more of a random access process. Anyway, so this codex is going to change drastically the way people are going to work, from a process of writing and researching and doing their work. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about making books. The study of books is an independent specialty all its own in history. It's rather new, but very fascinating because it gives us important insights into how people think and how they collect knowledge. Now, there will be very few books at the beginning that they will have to be organized, collected, and copied, which is something that this Eastern Roman Empire will be very well known for. Um, but books in the West become very, very rare, uh, almost to the point of, well, what we'll see is um, in the West, after about 475 CE, we're going to see a lowering of a standard of literacy. However, in the East, in Constantinople and that area, literacy will shoot up, books will be saved, and that information is going to be passed on, and then it's going to be spread around from there. But in the West, we'll see not just a vacuum of government power and a vacuum of military power and a vacuum of art, but also a vacuum of literacy. And that will be part of the story we're going to talk about next week. So that's the end of chapter 6. I will be shortly putting up a quiz or test for chapter 6. When I put up the tests, you'll find them on Canvas. I will always give you a full week to take these tests, no matter when I post them. And remember, I don't now have penalties for late works, if only because of, the situation we're in, but try to keep up with these tests. So, be aware that they're going to go up, be aware that they're going to have time limits, and we're going to have the midterm next Thursday. I will put up guidelines for the midterm so that you can read and understand and get some ideas on what to study, but the actual physical midterm will not be posted until next Wednesday night, and you will have 24 hours to take it. As always, if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them while these lectures are going in the live chat. Once we are no longer in class time, if you could please kindly send me emails, I will answer them as quickly as I possibly can. I've got a huge load of emails. I would doubly appreciate it if you could please use your class number. That's 080L in the subject line so I know what class you're in. Otherwise, I have to go searching in all of my Canvas to find out what class you're in. So if you leave me the number, that's best. I am planning on having an extra office hour by Zoom at 3:00 today. I will put the address in the announcements. It's not mandatory that you be there. You do not have to go. But if you have questions or queries, or you want to let me know anything about things like grading, you're welcome to join me at that time and ask the questions there. I want to transfer this entire class over to a Zoom-based class in the future. So be reading up on Zoom and how to do it. On your end, it's strictly going to be just follow the link going into class. And hopefully we can encourage a little bit more conversation, a little bit more discussion, and I maybe can see your faces, which would be really cool. Because all I'm seeing is my camera right now. So we want to be moving on to that. Be aware that there are certain new policies about things like grading that are very important, especially for during this semester. We are defaulting our grades not to letter grades, but to pass withdraw. I don't know if I explained this to you on Tuesday, if you go to the frequently asked questions of the NOVA website, it will explain that better. So definitely read it, depending on your, Lee says YouTube Live is better. It's more convenient. I kind of agree with you as well. If there is a consistent message that people say, I don't like Zoom, it's not as good, it's harder to work. I know I'm more familiar with YouTube. My technical director is more familiar with YouTube, and I'm doing it on YouTube so that there's a recording of it that stays there at a permanent address, and you can just go to that address and you can listen to it on your phone. And also in YouTube, you can speed it up to 1.5 to 2 times the speed, and I sound much more like a chipmunk than I normally do. And also it's closed caption, so you can have it that way. So it gives you, I think, more flexibility. If we find that everyone would rather have it on YouTube than on Zoom, and we'll duly note what you have, maybe we'll have a more mixed class where we'll do part of it on YouTube and part of it on Zoom. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience. I appreciate you being here. I know I got out a little bit early, but I don't want to make you sit here for hour after hour reading, watching videos. I'd much rather have you spend the time reading your textbook and taking the quizzes. Okay, have a nice weekend, everybody. I'll see you next Thursday. Tuesday. Tuesday. Thank you. He's a smarty.